our buddy Kenny from Denver, Colorado, hits us up and says, hey, I get that FSU-Miami was a big deal back in the day, but why spend any time talking about it now when it hasn't mattered in years and the sport doesn't need it anyway? This is borderline disrespectful to one of the great rivalries of our sport. As Meemaw used to always tell me, you don't need a shower every day. We much prefer that you take one. College football doesn't need any team to be good. College football doesn't need any rivalry to be good. College football is a whole heck of a lot more entertaining when certain teams are good and certain rivalries are hot. But speaking of hot, let me cool down for just a second, because this is one of those times where I have to be dealt a reminder that when we pull up the analytics for our show, when we pull up the viewer and listener data, we've got a very young listener and viewer. I would imagine out of the national shows, we've got the youngest average age listening to the show, which is really good for advertisers. But it's also something that has to make me pause every now and then, like right now. Because if you're 17 years old, you know a few things. You know the state of Florida puts out a ton of really good football players. You know that. You know Florida pumps out elite college football players. In fact, that state, over the past 5 recruiting cycles, has pumped out an average of close to 35 of the top 247. The state of Florida, over the past 5 recruiting cycles, has averaged pumping out 14% of the top 247. Loaded state. You've known that. What you haven't known, if you're 17 years old, is a world where most of them stay home. But once upon a time, that was the case. Once upon a time, if they didn't go to Tallahassee, they were going to Coral Gables. A lot of them went to Gainesville as well, because in the height of the FSU-Miami rivalry, Steve Spurrier was also killing it at Florida. So imagine one of my 17-year-old listeners right now, and you're out in Denver, Colorado, imagine a world where instead of going to Columbus or Clemson or Tuscaloosa or Athens, those kids from South Florida, those kids even from the Panhandle, they said, go Gators, they said, go Noles, they said, go Canes, and they went and played their ball there. What would that do? Well, it would create some of the most fierce rivalry college football you've ever seen in your life. It would be intense. There would be high-level future NFL draft picks all over the starting 22 for both teams on the field. You would also have the state pride. You simply, if you're a younger viewer or listener, you haven't been immersed in a world where you are trained to know that when you look at that helmet grid schedule, you got to circle that FSU-Miami week. You know right now, Ohio State, Michigan's at the end of the year. Let's see where OU, Texas falls. Like, does Georgia play Bama this year? It used to be when the schedules were released, one of the first questions in people's minds was, which week is FSU-Miami? Because you were about to see this passion play of intensity, off the charts of intensity, but just the pride that bled out of that game is unbelievable. Because all those kids stayed home. A lot of them stayed home to play. And it's not to say they never went out of state, but they knew we've got to load up this roster with kids from this state, because when we get into that game, there's this intangible that exists. Like we got the star players, but there's this intangible that exists. And that's guys not willing to go up to the edge of the cliff. But when pride, state pride, being from the state of Florida and what it means to play football in that state is on the line, we're going to have a critical mass of guys on our roster willing to go over the cliff, especially when that team's on the other side of the field. That's what it was like every year. So you can tell me college football doesn't need it. Well, obviously college football didn't need it because the rivalry has sucked for quite a while now, and college football has surged. That doesn't mean FSU-Miami was irrelevant. It means college football is really a monster, but if Florida State and Miami nationally relevant was injected back into it, it would just make the sport all the better. And I don't want to just leave Florida out of that, because this year, pay attention to this. You know who Miami opens with this year? They open in the Swamp. Miami goes to Florida in week 1. Florida State plays Miami every year. Florida State plays Florida every year. UCF's getting them some of that action. UCF plays Florida this year. So there's a whole lot of that round robin nature, especially the big 3 down there of facing off, and it'll be fun because I would stop well short of saying all 3 are back. No one's saying that on the show tonight. Norvell and Florida State have been closest, but they're recruiting collectively better than they have in quite a while. They are trending up collectively better than they have in a while. I understand it's a lot easier to buy into Florida State right now than Florida. Which way does it feel like all three are at least trending? And I think most people would agree on at least two of the three. I would argue three of the three are trending in the right direction. But that stat, that recruiting stat, man, like if you're, I don't care if you're 10 years old, if you don't know anything about the FSU-Miami rivalry, but you do know about the sport a little bit, just imagine a state that pumps out about 14 to 15% of the top 247 high school players in the country every year, and then imagine there are major programs in that state that keep a majority of them home, and then they play each other. Oh, it's unbelievable. It's unbelievable.